The confirmation of Luna Nozawa's death had once felt definitive, a brutal punctuation mark at the end of a story too volatile to remain open-ended. Official statements had been issued, legal processes initiated, and public grief shaped into a narrative that allowed Los Angeles to move forward without looking too closely at the shadows left behind. Miss Dillon's confession, delivered with trembling resolve and a voice worn thin by fear, seemed to seal that narrative with moral clarity. She admitted her role, accepted her culpability, and positioned herself as the final keeper of a truth that had already cost too much. For Will and Elektra, the confirmation brought a complicated sense of closure, not peace exactly, but the fragile relief that comes when uncertainty is replaced by something solid enough to be mourned. Yet even then, there were fractures in the story that refused to stay buried. Whispers circulated quietly at first, dismissed as the predictable aftershocks of a tragedy that had captured too much attention. Rumors that Luna's body had never been recovered in full, that certain records had been amended too quickly, that witnesses had been coached into silence rather than questioned thoroughly. These murmurs were easy to ignore in a city accustomed to spectacle and reinvention, but they lingered, accumulating weight as time passed without resolution. For Elektra, whose instincts had already been sharpened by earlier deceptions, the rumors felt less like noise and more like an echo, a reminder that the truth rarely arrives whole. The revelation came without warning and without mercy. Luna did not return gradually, nor did she announce herself through intermediaries or controlled disclosures. She appeared instead as a living contradiction to everything that had been accepted as fact, stepping into the light with a composure that felt almost unnatural for someone presumed dead. Her reappearance shattered the illusion of certainty that had settled over Will and Elektra's lives, forcing them to confront the terrifying possibility that closure itself had been another fabrication. Luna was alive, unmistakably so, and her presence rewrote the meaning of every event that had followed her supposed death. Luna's explanation unfolded slowly, not because she sought drama, but because the truth was layered and dangerous. She revealed that her death had been staged with meticulous care, not as an act of vanity or escape, but as a last resort to sever herself from a threat that had grown too large, too pervasive to confront directly. She spoke of forces operating far beyond personal vendettas, of a network entrenched within Los Angeles that thrived on secrecy and expendability. In this world, people like Luna were not enemies to be destroyed openly but liabilities to be erased quietly, their stories reshaped to serve larger agendas. Miss Dillon's confession, Luna explained, had been both genuine and incomplete. Dillon had acted under pressure, manipulated into believing she was complicit in something contained, something that would end once Luna disappeared. In reality, Dillon had been a pawn, positioned to absorb blame and provide a convenient conclusion to an operation that demanded deniability. The confirmation of Luna's death had been essential not only to protect those orchestrating the scheme but to signal compliance within a system that punished deviation with annihilation. For Will, Luna's return was a seismic shock that destabilized his sense of reality. He had grieved her not as a lover, but as a source of trauma, a figure whose absence allowed him to begin reconstructing his identity after chaos. To see her alive forced him to revisit emotions he believed he had resolved, anger entwined with disbelief, relief colliding with resentment. Luna's explanation challenged his understanding of her actions, reframing behaviors he had condemned as symptoms of coercion rather than malice. Yet this reframing did not absolve the pain she had caused him, nor did it erase the scars left by her disappearance. Elektra's response was quieter, but no less profound. She recognized immediately that Luna's survival validated instincts she had been taught to doubt, instincts that had guided her through layers of deception before. At the same time, Luna's revelation reopened wounds Elektra had only just begun to heal. The certainty she had fought for, the clarity she had earned through confrontation and choice, now dissolved into ambiguity once more. Elektra found herself grappling not only with the return of a presumed dead woman but with the realization that her own life had been shaped by a lie designed to protect a much darker truth. As Luna detailed the conspiracy that had necessitated her disappearance, the scope of the threat became terrifyingly clear. What had been framed as an isolated tragedy was revealed as a node within a sprawling network that trafficked in influence, fear, and disposable lives. Los Angeles, with its polished surfaces and relentless reinvention, provided the perfect camouflage for such operations. Power was exercised not through overt violence, but through strategic silence, through the careful manipulation of narratives and the calculated sacrifice of those deemed inconvenient. Dylan's role, once perceived as central, diminished in scale against this backdrop. Her confession had been engineered as a pressure release, a way to redirect scrutiny away from the architects of the scheme and toward a single, containable figure. Luna spoke of meetings she had overheard, of threats delivered indirectly, of choices framed as inevitabilities. Her staged death had been both a capitulation and an act of defiance, allowing her to disappear while preserving the possibility of exposing the truth from a position of safety. The impact of Luna's return rippled outward with devastating force. Legal proceedings grounded to a halt as foundational assumptions were overturned. Authorities faced the humiliating reality that they had been complicit, whether through negligence or coercion, in perpetuating a false conclusion. The credibility of institutions already strained by scandal eroded further, replaced by a public hunger for accountability that could no longer be satisfied by scapegoats. For Will and Elektra, the personal consequences were inescapable. Luna's reappearance destabilized their already fragile relationship, reintroducing unresolved history at a moment when both were struggling to redefine themselves. Will confronted the uncomfortable truth that his healing had been predicated on absence rather than understanding, while Elektra faced the possibility that her pursuit of stability had been interrupted by forces beyond her control. The love triangle that had once dominated their emotional landscape now felt almost trivial against the magnitude of the revelations unfolding around them. Yet it was precisely this contrast that forced Elektra to confront a deeper question about agency. Luna's return underscored how easily lives could be redirected by hidden hands, how choice itself could be manipulated into illusion. Elektra understood that the stability she sought could not be achieved through alignment with any single person, but through an unwavering commitment to truth, even when that truth threatened to dismantle everything familiar. Luna's motives, as she articulated them, were neither purely altruistic nor entirely self-serving. She admitted fear without shame, acknowledging that survival had guided her decisions as much as justice. At the same time, her return signaled a refusal to remain invisible, a recognition that disappearance was not enough to dismantle a system built on erasure. By stepping back into the world, Luna accepted the risk of retaliation in exchange for the possibility of exposure. The conspiracy she unveiled implicated figures whose names carried weight far beyond personal relationships, extending into corporate, political, and cultural spheres. It revealed how crises were manufactured and resolved to preserve the appearance of order, how individuals were positioned as villains or martyrs, depending on what the narrative required. Dylan's confession, once hailed as courageous, now appeared tragic, a testament to how easily conscience could be weaponized against itself. As the truth spread, Los Angeles responded with a mixture of outrage and fatigue. Some demanded justice with renewed fervor, while others retreated into cynicism, convinced that the system would once again protect itself at the expense of the vulnerable. Luna's survival became both symbol and provocation, challenging the city to confront the cost of its indifference. For Will, the path forward demanded reckoning rather than resolution. He was forced to acknowledge that his story with Luna could not be rewritten into something simpler, that her actions and his suffering could coexist without cancellation. This acknowledgement did not bring reconciliation, but it offered a form of clarity grounded in complexity rather than denial. Elektra emerged from the upheaval with a sharpened sense of purpose. She recognized that her role was no longer confined to navigating personal relationships, but extended into the ethical terrain exposed by Luna's return. The instincts that had once drawn her into investigation now guided her toward a broader confrontation with systems that thrived on silence. She understood that the stability she sought would not be handed to her. It would be built through resistance to narratives designed to pacify rather than reveal. Luna's reappearance marked not an ending but a reckoning, a moment when buried truths surfaced with consequences that could not be contained. The staged death that once protected her now became a catalyst for exposure, transforming a personal escape into a collective challenge. In revealing the larger conspiracy, Luna dismantled the illusion that Dylan had acted alone, exposing the machinery that required such pawns to function. The aftermath promised no easy justice, only the difficult work of sustained accountability. Relationships would fracture, institutions would resist, and retaliation would remain a constant threat. Yet within this uncertainty lay the possibility of change, fragile and incomplete but real. Luna's survival forced a re-examination of who was expendable and who was protected, who controlled the narrative and who paid the price for its convenience. For Will and Elektra, the return of the woman they believed dead redefined their understanding of truth itself. It reminded them that certainty was often manufactured, that survival sometimes demanded deception, and that confronting darkness required more than courage. It required endurance. As the conspiracy unraveled, they stood at the threshold of a future shaped not by illusion, but by the relentless, destabilizing power of truth finally refusing to stay buried. The first message arrived on Katie's phone just after midnight, at the hour when the city's noise thinned into something deceptively calm and the mind became most vulnerable to doubt. It contained no greeting, no signature, only a string of numbers followed by a single sentence that felt less like information than an accusation. The numbers corresponded to a financial ledger entry buried years deep within a shell corporation tied to Los Angeles real estate, and the sentence that followed suggested, with chilling restraint, that this entry was the beginning rather than the end of a story. Katie stared at the screen for a long time before locking her phone, aware that whatever had just entered her life was not asking for permission to stay. Elektra received her message the following morning. Unlike Katie's, it arrived with context rather than data, a brief but unsettling reminder of a conversation she once had with Luna Nozawa, a moment she had dismissed at the time as paranoia born of stress. The message quoted Luna's words almost verbatim, referencing her fear that money moved through Los Angeles like blood through hidden veins, nourishing power while poisoning those who stumbled too close. At the end of the message was a warning rather than a question. Some truths, once seen, could not be unseen, and some people would kill to keep them buried. Elektra felt the air leave her lungs as she read, realizing that the message was not only informed, but intimate. Neither woman spoke to anyone else at first. Years of experience had taught them that instinct often mattered more than consensus in moments like this. Katie, whose life had been shaped by proximity to power and its consequences, recognized the language of financial manipulation immediately. It was not the overt corruption that frightened her, but the subtlety of it, the way influence disguised itself as inevitability. Elektra, still carrying the emotional residue of Luna's supposed death and subsequent reappearance, felt the past surge forward with renewed urgency. Luna had not been spiraling without reason. She had been uncovering something that terrified her enough to document, question, and ultimately confront. The messages continued over the next several days, arriving at irregular intervals and from untraceable sources. Together, they formed a fragmented map pointing toward a truth neither Katie nor Elektra had sought but both were now compelled to follow. The clues led them through layers of financial obfuscation, shell companies nested within trusts, charitable foundations that existed only on paper, and investment vehicles designed to move enormous sums without scrutiny. At the center of this web was a name that carried enormous weight in Los Angeles, a figure whose influence extended seamlessly across business, politics, and culture, someone widely regarded as untouchable. As they pieced the evidence together, a horrifying picture emerged. Luna had stumbled upon a financial secret that threatened to expose not just illegal transactions, but a system of leverage built on exploitation. Money had been laundered through legitimate enterprises, funding ventures that masked coercion and silence as opportunity. Those who benefited were protected by layers of legal insulation and public goodwill, while those who questioned the flow were isolated, discredited, or erased. Luna, it became clear, had not been reckless. She had been methodical, tracing inconsistencies that others had learned to ignore. Katie's involvement shifted from curiosity to commitment as she recognized the stakes. She had spent years navigating the edges of powerful systems, aware of their capacity for generosity and cruelty in equal measure. What unsettled her now was not simply the scale of the corruption, but the precision with which it had been concealed. This was not opportunistic crime. It was structural, embedded so deeply that its exposure threatened to destabilize institutions that many depended upon. Katie understood that uncovering the truth would not result in a single arrest or a dramatic confession. It would provoke resistance, retaliation, and denial on a scale few were prepared to face. Electra felt a different kind of pressure. For her, this investigation was inseparable from Luna herself, from the guilt and grief that had lingered even after Luna's reappearance reframed the narrative. Each document they uncovered felt like a conversation interrupted by death, a continuation of the work Luna had been doing alone. Electra began to see patterns in Luna's behavior that now made devastating sense: her agitation, her distrust, her sense of being watched. Luna had not been unraveling. She had been cornered. The realization that Luna's death was not an accident, but a meticulously disguised assassination arrived gradually, like a bruise darkening beneath the skin. The financial trail revealed transactions that coincided precisely with key moments in Luna's final days: payments to intermediaries, settlements disguised as consulting fees, and sudden transfers that ceased abruptly after her death was confirmed. The conclusion was unavoidable. Luna had been eliminated because she knew too much, because she refused to be intimidated into silence, because her conscience had outpaced her protection. This knowledge placed Katie and Electra squarely in danger. The messages they received shifted in tone, no longer guiding but cautioning, urging them to stop before they crossed a line from investigation into exposure. Anonymous calls ended in silence. Cars lingered too long outside familiar places. Digital accounts showed signs of intrusion subtle enough to deny, but persistent enough to intimidate. Katie recognized these tactics immediately, the warning signs of a system activating its defenses. Electra felt the fear settle into her bones, a familiar sensation that echoed Luna's own final weeks. Yet fear did not stop them. Instead, it sharpened their resolve. Katie understood that retreat would not guarantee safety, only compliance. Electra knew that walking away would mean allowing Luna's death to remain a footnote rather than a reckoning. Together, they moved carefully, documenting everything, creating redundancies, ensuring that the truth could not be silenced simply by targeting them. They became methodical, almost ritualistic in their approach, aware that one mistake could cost them everything. As they drew closer to identifying the mastermind behind Luna's assassination, the emotional toll intensified. Katie grappled with the realization that someone she had once defended publicly, someone whose philanthropy she had admired, was capable of ordering a death to protect financial secrecy. The betrayal cut deeply, forcing her to reevaluate her own complicity in a culture that equated success with virtue. Electra wrestled with anger as much as grief, enraged that Luna's courage had been punished while cowardice continued to thrive under the guise of respectability. The mastermind, when their identity became clear, was not a caricature of evil but a symbol of the system itself. Their power lay not in brutality, but in normalization, in the ability to make exploitation appear necessary and silence appear rational. Luna's murder had not required overt violence. It had required only the manipulation of circumstance, the nudging of events until her death could be dismissed as tragic, but unremarkable. This subtlety was the most terrifying revelation of all. The closer Katie and Electra came to exposing the truth, the more isolated they became. Allies distanced themselves under vague pretenses. Meetings were canceled. Opportunities evaporated. The message was unmistakable. The cost of truth was loneliness. Yet in that isolation, they found a shared clarity. They were no longer operating under illusion. They understood the risks, the sacrifices, and the moral weight of what they were attempting. This was no longer about justice alone, but about refusing to participate in a lie that demanded death as its price. The final evidence, when it surfaced, arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as confirmation. A digital file hidden within an innocuous archive, accessible only through a sequence Luna herself had devised, contained everything: financial records, correspondence, contingency plans, and a chilling acknowledgement that her life was expendable. Reading it felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, aware that stepping forward would change everything forever. Katie and Elektra understood that exposing the truth would unleash consequences they could not control. Legal battles would follow, reputations would collapse, and retaliation would be inevitable. But they also understood that silence would be a far greater betrayal. Luna had paid for her discovery with her life. To turn away now would be to accept that cost as justified. As they prepared to release the evidence, the danger intensified. Surveillance became overt. Threats sharpened. The city that had once felt familiar now seemed hostile, every shadow a reminder of the power arrayed against them. Yet within that fear was a strange calm, born of alignment between belief and action. They were no longer reacting to danger. They were choosing to confront it. Luna Nozawa's true legacy, Katie realized, was not the tragedy of her death, but the courage of her refusal to look away. Elektra saw in Luna's final act not despair but defiance, a belief that truth mattered even when it offered no guarantee of survival. In carrying that belief forward, Katie and Elektra stepped into a lineage of resistance that Los Angeles had long tried to erase. The story of Luna's death was no longer about how she died, but why. And in answering that question, Katie and Elektra exposed a truth powerful enough to destabilize those who believed themselves immune. The danger they faced was real, immediate, and unrelenting. But so was their resolve. In a city built on illusion, they chose revelation, knowing that once the truth was unleashed, it would no longer belong to them alone.